Story 1. I worked the night shift as a security guard at a massive corporate office building. It wasn't my first overnight job, and I thought I had seen and dealt with everything. Creaks in old buildings, strange noises, and even the occasional prankster trying to mess with security. But nothing prepared me for what happened that one night. The building itself was cold, sterile, and dead silent during the night. During the day, it was buzzing with employees, but at night it was just me, my partner in the camera room, and endless rounds of empty hallways, offices, and maintenance rooms. The air always felt heavy, but I chalked it up to the stillness of the building and my overactive imagination. That night started like any other. I clocked in, grabbed my radio, and began my rounds. The hallway I dreaded the most was on the 5th floor, a long, narrow corridor stretching over 400 feet, lined with offices on both sides. At the far end was a large floor-to-ceiling window. Something about that hallway always gave me the creeps. It was too quiet, and the way the lights reflected off the glossy floors felt off. But work was work. I started my walk down the corridor, stopping every few feet to check the office doors and glance through the small windows on them to make sure everything was secure. I wasn't paying much attention at first, just doing my routine. Then out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone in the reflection of one of the office door windows. A tall, shadowy figure standing directly behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I turned around, but there was no one there. I shook my head and muttered, "Just my reflection," trying to laugh it off. The stress of the job and being alone in a huge building could mess with your head, I told myself. I kept walking, but something didn't feel right. The hallway seemed longer than usual, like I wasn't getting any closer to the window at the end. I quickened my pace, staring straight ahead. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I caught another glimpse of myself in the window at the end of the hall. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. It looked like there was a second head, yes, a second head, hovering just above my shoulder. It wasn't clear, just a blurry, shadowy outline. But it was there. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned sharply to look behind me. Nothing. No one. The hallway was completely empty, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing straight up. I muttered to myself, "You're imagining things. It's late, you're tired, just finish the round." But my hands were shaking as I grabbed my flashlight tighter and started walking again. This time, I couldn't resist glancing at every reflective surface I passed. The office windows, the glass doors, anything. And every single time I saw it, that same shadowy figure behind me, following me, blending into my reflection like it was part of me. By the time I reached the end of the hall, my nerves were completely shot. I didn't care about finishing my round properly. I just wanted to get out of that hallway. I turned to head back to the stairwell, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full-on sprint. Then my radio crackled. "Hey, my partner's voice came through, hesitant and shaky. Is someone with you right now?" I stopped in my tracks, my blood turning to ice. "What do you mean?" "No, it's just me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause, and then he said, "I don't think so. I just saw something on the cameras. Looked like someone was walking behind you in the 5th floor hallway." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt dry and my chest tightened. I slowly turned around and scanned the hallway behind me. It was empty. Completely empty. "I'm getting out of here," I said into the radio, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, man, just get down here," my partner replied, his voice just as shaky as mine. I didn't bother checking the rest of the offices. I bolted for the stairwell, my footsteps echoing through the eerily quiet hallway. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to look back, but I couldn't help it. Right before I reached the door, I glanced at the window one last time. The shadow wasn't behind me anymore. It was standing in the middle of the hallway, perfectly still, staring right at me. I slammed through the stairwell door and ran all the way down to the security room, barely able to catch my breath. My partner looked as pale as I felt. "I saw it, man. Whatever it was, I saw it," he said, staring at the monitors. I didn't stay to review the footage or figure out what we saw. I couldn't. The next morning, I handed in my transfer request and never stepped foot in that building again. Story 2. I work as a night shift security guard at a distribution warehouse on the outskirts of a small, unremarkable town. It's the kind of place people pass through without ever stopping, just a cluster of truck stops, warehouses, and the occasional diner. I'd been doing this job for about 2 years. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was steady, and I didn't mind the solitude. Nights out in the yard were quiet, mostly paperwork, checking in and out trailers, and the hum of distant highway traffic. The shack we work in is nothing special. A single-room structure made mostly of cheap glass and metal, with windows on all 4 sides to give us a full view of the yard. Inside, there's a desk, a few monitors for the surveillance cameras, a battered coffee maker, and a couple of chairs. It's utilitarian, cold, and brightly lit. At night, those windows turn into mirrors, reflecting the harsh fluorescence back at you. You see yourself, the desk, and the monitors, but sometimes you see more. I'd caught glimpses, just faint, fleeting reflections, of people moving behind me in the glass. A shadow crossing the doorway, a figure leaning against the wall. It never felt threatening, but it was unnerving. Every time I turned around, there'd be nothing. The first few times I laughed it off as fatigue or tricks of the light. It's easy for your mind to play games with you during the long, quiet hours of the night. One night, though, things went further. It was just past 3 a.m., the dead hours when everything feels heavier. My co-worker, Josh, had stepped out to do a walkthrough of the yard, leaving me alone in the shack. I was sipping on my 3rd cup of bitter coffee, scanning the monitors half-heartedly, when I saw something move in the corner of my eye. The reflection in the window across from me, a tall, dark figure standing perfectly still behind my chair. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move at first, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me. Nothing. Just the empty shack, silent except for the soft hum of the monitors. I let out a shaky breath and forced a laugh. "Okay," I muttered to myself. "You're losing it." But when I looked back at the window, the reflection was still there, clear as day. This time, I didn't freeze. I shot out of my chair, spinning around so fast the coffee cup tipped over on the desk. But the shack was empty. Nothing. No one. The monitors showed the same thing they always did. The yard, the gates, the perimeter. Not a soul in sight. But when I glanced back at the glass, the figure was still there. It wasn't standing behind my chair anymore. Now it was closer to the door. I don't know what compelled me, but I reached for the door handle and yanked it open, stepping outside into the cold night air. The yard was bathed in the pale orange glow of the sodium lights. Rows of parked trailers stretched out into the darkness, their shadows long and sharp. I called out, "Hello? Josh?" My voice echoed, thin and hollow. No response, just the distant rumble of an idling truck somewhere far off. I circled the shack, looking for any sign of movement, any explanation, but the air was still, and the ground was undisturbed. When I came back around to the front, the door to the shack was closed. I was sure I'd left it open. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The coffee cup was still tipped over, its contents dripping off the edge of the desk onto the floor. But the reflection in the window, it was gone. I sat back down, my hands trembling as I picked up the cup. I cleaned the spill as best as I could, telling myself it was over, that I was just seeing things. Fatigue, caffeine jitters, an overactive imagination. It had to be one of those, right? But deep down, I didn't believe it. Josh came back about 20 minutes later, whistling some out-of-tune melody as he opened the door. "You good?" he asked, glancing at the mess on the desk. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just spilled some coffee. Long night." He nodded, didn't press, and sat down across from me. I watched him for a moment, considering whether I should tell him what happened. But what would I say? That I saw something in the window that wasn't there? That it moved when I didn't? The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that shack. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that figure again. But there was nothing. Not in the glass, not on the monitors. When my shift ended, I was almost relieved to step out into the dawn light. I didn't mention anything to Josh as we swapped stories about our plans for the weekend. I didn't say anything to my supervisor either, but when I got home, I couldn't sleep. Story 3. Graveyard shifts had a strange way of bending time. Maybe it was the stillness of the night, the heavy blanket of quiet that draped over the casino floor after the last drunk stumbled out and the machines fell silent. Or maybe it was the fluorescent lights humming against the darkness outside, making it feel like time itself was held hostage within these walls. I supervised the cashier area, small, tucked away, almost forgotten in the back of the casino. I didn't mind it though. I'd always worked graves, nights were my domain, until that night. It was just past 5 in the morning. Back when we closed the floor at 4 a.m., the place would be empty by now, save for the faint smell of stale alcohol and cigarettes. The shift had been uneventful, just the usual mix of tired regulars and unlucky players draining their last crumpled bills before calling it a night. My assistant Carla was supposed to be helping me wrap up, but she'd had to run home for a bit, something about forgetting to lock her door. I didn't question it. I'd be fine on my own. I stood at the counter, head down, working through the paperwork. The familiar rhythm of numbers and calculations helped pass the time. My hair, loose and unkempt, kept falling into my face as I leaned forward. I tucked it back repeatedly, frustrated, when I felt movement. Not mine, not around me, but close enough to register. My first thought was that my hair had shifted again. But no, this was different. Peripheral vision caught the swivel chair, one of the cashier chairs, moving. Not just moving, spinning, slowly. A deliberate, smooth turn that sent a cold rush down my spine. I froze. The chair wasn't close enough for me to have bumped it. It sat to my right, pushed neatly against the counter like all the others. And yet, there it was, turning. My breathing hitched as I stood there paralyzed, watching it rotate in a full, eerie circle before coming to a stop, perfectly still again. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when you know someone's staring at you. My stomach clenched, and for a brief moment, I thought about calling out, just to break the oppressive silence. But I didn't. I couldn't. My voice felt stuck somewhere deep in my throat. Instead, I just stared at the chair. Was it a draft? But there were no windows here, no vents strong enough to make something that heavy move like that. Maybe it was the air conditioning, or maybe... I shook my head. Don't be ridiculous. That's what I told myself. It's just a chair, a stupid chair. Maybe it wasn't balanced right. Maybe the floor was uneven. There had to be an explanation. Something simple, something logical. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder toward the locked entrance to the casino floor, then toward the back office. Nothing. The cameras above, their little red lights blinking, provided no comfort. They only made me feel more exposed, like I was under scrutiny. The silence pressed against me, the kind of silence that wasn't just an absence of sound, but a living, breathing thing, heavy, suffocating. I decided to sit down, forcing myself to focus back on the paperwork. Carla would be back soon, but the chair, I couldn't stop glancing at it. Every time my eyes darted toward it, I half expected to see it spinning again. It didn't. It just sat there, motionless, as if mocking me for my paranoia. And then I heard it, a faint noise, a low, almost imperceptible creak, like wood under pressure. My eyes darted toward the source, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed in the empty room. The chair. It didn't move this time, but I swore I heard it, like someone had just leaned against it. My breath caught and my body tensed. I scanned the room, desperate for a sign, something to tell me what the hell was going on. But there was nothing, just the unyielding quiet, the harsh fluorescent light, and that damn chair. I stood up, my hands trembling. I wanted to leave, to wait for Carla outside, but the thought of stepping away from the counter felt wrong. Unsafe, like turning my back on something I couldn't see, but knew was there. I grabbed my phone, the screen lighting up my shaking hands. 5:12 a.m. I typed out a message to Carla, my thumbs fumbling over the keyboard. "Hey, when will you be back?" Before I could hit send, I heard it again. A creak, louder this time. I whipped around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The chair was moving again. Slowly, deliberately, it turned to face me. And this time it didn't stop. It kept spinning, faster and faster, the sound of its rotation filling the air, an unnatural whirring that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, the phone slipping from my grip and clattering onto the counter. "Stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. And then, it did. It stopped, abruptly, completely, facing me. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no sense to be made. No logic, no explanation. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that chair. It felt like hours, but it must have been seconds. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but I forced myself to move, to reach for my phone. My fingers brushed against the screen, and in that instant, the lights flickered. Not a soft, gentle flicker, but a violent strobe that plunged the room into darkness, for split seconds at a time. In those moments of blackness, I thought I saw something, a shadow, a figure, standing just behind the chair, watching me. The lights steadied and the room was empty again. Carla returned minutes later, cheerful and oblivious. I didn't say anything. How could I? What would I even say? "Hey, Carla, the chair was possessed." She'd laugh and maybe she'd be right too, but I never worked a graveyard shift alone again. Story 4. It was 2006. I was a college student back then, juggling classes and my part-time job as a security guard at the Louvre in Paris. Day shifts were straightforward, tourists, cameras, and the constant hum of excitement. The night shift, though, that was different. I only heard about it from the others, especially Julian. He'd worked there for years, mostly nights, and he had stories that weren't meant to be told. I remember the first time he mentioned it. We were in the break room, and he leaned over with this nervous smirk. "You ever hear about the Salle des Armes? The sword corridor?" I asked, sipping coffee. I knew the room, of course. It was a long, narrow corridor lined with ancient blades, some ceremonial, some clearly made for battle. A quiet, almost oppressive part of the museum. "What about it?" Julian hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "We don't patrol it alone anymore. Not after what happened to Renee." Renee was another night guard, one of the older guys. Julian's tone made me press him further. "Why? What happened?" Julian leaned in, lowering his voice. "Renee was doing his rounds late one night, walking through that corridor. It's always quiet there. No sound except your own footsteps echoing off the stone walls. He had his flashlight, shining it on the swords, just routine. Then," Julian paused, his eyes darting to the door as if someone might walk in. "Something grabbed him." I blinked. Grabbed him? Pulled his jacket, hard, nearly knocked him off his feet. He thought someone was messing with him, but when he turned around, nothing. No one. I tried to laugh it off, but Julian shook his head. "They checked the security footage. You can see his jacket jerk back, like someone yanked it. But there's no one there." "What did the chief say?" Julian smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Told him to forget about it. Just some equipment malfunction." He used air quotes. "But after that, we don't walk that corridor alone anymore. Ever." I laughed, brushing it off. Ghost stories to pass the time, I thought, until that night. It was a Tuesday late autumn. I had picked up a rare night shift, covering for another guard who called out sick. The museum after dark was different, silent, heavy. The air felt thicker, the shadows darker. I wasn't superstitious, but something about being alone in those endless halls made the hairs on my neck stand up. Around 2 a.m., I found myself near the Salle des Armes. It wasn't on my route, but curiosity got the better of me. Julian's story played in my head, his voice almost daring me to go. My flashlight beam bounced off the polished floors as I stepped into the corridor. The swords glinted faintly in the dim light, their edges sharp even after centuries. The silence was deafening. No hum of distant machinery, no creak of old wood, just my footsteps. I tried to shrug off the unease, focusing on the routine. Check the doors, scan the cameras, move on. Easy. Halfway down the corridor, I heard it, a faint rustle, like fabric shifting. I froze, shining my flashlight around. The beam swept over the swords, their shadows stretching and contorting against the walls. "Hello?" My voice sounded absurdly loud. No answer. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the HVAC system kicking on. But then I felt it. A tug. Not gentle. Not like brushing against something by accident. This was deliberate. A sharp, sudden yank on the back of my jacket. I stumbled forward, spinning around so fast I almost dropped my flashlight. The beam of light danced wildly over the empty corridor. Empty. No one. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The words echoed back at me, mocking. I backed up against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw it. On the far end of the corridor, just at the edge of the flashlight's reach, a shadow moved. Not a person. No, it was too tall, too thin. It flickered like smoke, and then it was gone. I bolted. I didn't care about protocol, about finishing my round. I just needed to get out. My footsteps echoed wildly as I sprinted down the hall, my flashlight bouncing erratically. When I reached the main room, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the walkie-talkie. "Main room, now!" I managed to choke out. Julian and another guard, Mark, came running. Julian took one look at me and his face paled. "You went to the salle des armes, didn't you?" I nodded, struggling to find words. Mark stayed quiet, his expression grim. We checked the cameras later. I didn't want to watch, but Julian insisted. The footage showed me walking down the corridor, shining my flashlight. And then it happened. My jacket jerked back, violently, as if an invisible hand had grabbed it. My stumble was unmistakable, but there was no one there. No shadow, nothing. The chief dismissed it, of course. "Faulty equipment," he said, his tone flat. But Julian and Mark exchanged knowing looks. After that, I never worked a night shift again. Story 5. I don't know why I took the job at Colonial Williamsburg. Maybe it was the quiet, the history, or just needing work. But there I was, working late at night, locking up and shutting down the governor's palace and other buildings. It was peaceful most nights, a kind of eerie quiet that made the past feel closer than it should. That night, though, I wasn't feeling peaceful. I'd gotten a late start and was running behind, so when I finished up at the palace and started walking to my car, all I could think about was getting home. It was past midnight and the air was heavy, the kind that presses on your chest. My phone buzzed just as I reached the edge of the gravel parking lot. It was my boss. "You missed a light," he said, his voice clipped. "Where?" I asked, confused. "Governor's palace, attic window. It's glowing clear as day." I muttered a quick, "Yes, sir," and turned back. When I looked up, there it was, a faint yellow light spilling out from the attic window, standing out like a beacon in the darkness. I felt stupid for missing it. I hadn't been up to the attic since my training. It wasn't part of the usual rounds. Inside, the building was pitch black, the kind of dark where even shadows feel alive. My footsteps echoed as I climbed the stairs, each creak and groan reminding me how old this place was. Finally, I reached the attic ladder and climbed up. The second my head cleared the opening, I stopped. The attic was dark, no light, nothing. I pulled out my flashlight, sweeping it across the space. Empty, but for some old trunks and cobwebs. I climbed back down, annoyed. Maybe my boss had seen something else. A reflection, a trick of the light. I texted him, "It's out. Nothing's on up there." His reply came immediately. "Still on. Go check again." I was halfway to my car by then, and I almost ignored him. But I was new, and I didn't want trouble. Grumbling, I turned around. Sure enough, from outside, the light was on again. This time it looked brighter, almost flickering. My stomach tightened. Back inside, the house felt different, heavier. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I climbed the stairs. I reached the ladder and hesitated. The air smelled faintly sweet, like something burning. I climbed. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam bouncing off the walls. And again, nothing. The room was dark, empty. But this time the smell was stronger, unmistakable now. Wax, smoke, like a candle had just been blown out. I crouched near the window, where the light had been coming from. The glass felt warm under my fingertips. I stared out, trying to make sense of it. Then my phone buzzed again. "Are you messing with me?" my boss texted. "No," I shot back. "It's off. I'm staring right at it." But my gut churned. Something wasn't right. I climbed back down, shutting the attic door behind me with more force than I meant to. I was done. Let him deal with it. When I reached the ground floor, he was waiting for me, standing in the doorway. I didn't hear him come in, and it startled me. "You're seriously just going to leave it?" he snapped. "It's off," I said, louder than I meant to. "I went up there twice." He didn't argue, just pointed outside. The light was on again, bright, flickering. Neither of us spoke as we climbed back up. I wanted to prove to him I wasn't crazy. He wanted to prove I was. The house groaned under our weight, the air thicker than before. When we reached the attic, the smell hit us both. It was stronger, acrid, like something burning. He coughed and waved a hand in front of his face. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. I pushed the ladder up and climbed. The light switch was on the wall right by the opening. I reached for it, but before I could, I froze. The attic wasn't empty this time. The candle sat in the middle of the room. A single thin taper burned almost to the base. Wax had pooled around it, dripping down the sides in uneven streams. Smoke curled from the wick, dissipating into the air. The window was closed, but the curtain moved, shifting as if touched by a breeze. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered. My voice didn't sound like mine. He didn't answer. I reached out and touched the candle. It was warm, the wax soft under my fingers. I looked at my boss. He was pale, his hand gripping the ladder so tightly his knuckles were white. "What the hell is this?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." We stood there staring at the candle, at the faint haze of smoke that hovered near the ceiling. Neither of us moved. The room felt charged, like the air before a storm. Then faintly I heard it, a whisper. It came from the far corner of the attic, so soft I thought I imagined it. But my boss heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound, his eyes wide. "We need to go," he said, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. We practically tripped over each other climbing down, slamming the attic door shut behind us. The smell of smoke followed us all the way down the stairs, out the front door, into the cold night air. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we turned back. The attic window was dark. Neither of us spoke. We didn't lock up. We didn't check the other buildings. We just left. I quit the next day. Story 6. I'm a teacher, and my school sits at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that seem to stretch endlessly. It's an old building, red brick with high arched windows that creak when the wind presses against them. By day, it's noisy and vibrant, filled with the sounds of laughter, sneakers squeaking on polished floors, and the occasional reprimand echoing down the halls. But after hours, it's different. By the time the last bell rings, the place starts to feel empty, like it doesn't belong to the living anymore. I don't normally stay late, but last December I was buried under a pile of grating and had no choice. It was already dark when I glanced at the clock. 6:30 p.m. I told myself I'd finish marking the stack of math tests and leave before 7. The building was dead silent. Even the janitors had left early, thanks to the approaching holidays. My classroom, tucked into the farthest corner of the second floor, felt like an island cut off from everything. The only sound was the scratch of my pen against paper, the occasional groan of the heating vents, and my own sighs of frustration. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, so faint that I thought I imagined it. A soft giggle, high-pitched, childlike. I froze, pen hovering over a test paper. I strained my ears, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind whistling through the windows? But no, it came again, clearer this time. A child's laugh, echoing faintly down the hall. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound was startling in the stillness, and for a moment, I thought I'd scared off, whatever it was. But then it came again, louder, closer. "Hello?" My voice cracked slightly, echoing in the empty hallway as I stepped out of my classroom. Nothing. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I walked slowly down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the old carpet. Every classroom I passed was dark, their doors locked tight. The giggling came again, sharper now, as if it were right around the corner. "Hey, is someone there?" I called out, my voice louder, more forceful. Still no response. I quickened my pace, rounding the corner into another dimly lit hallway. This one was lined with the younger kids' classrooms. The bulletin boards were decorated with colorful handprints and snowflakes they'd made for the holidays. The sound seemed to come from further down, near the play area at the very end. I reached the doors to the playroom and hesitated. They were heavy, painted a cheery shade of blue, but now they felt off. The giggling had stopped, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. I pushed the doors open. The playroom was empty, or at least it looked that way. The moonlight streaming through the large windows cast eerie patterns on the walls, illuminating the rows of tiny chairs and scattered toys. But something was wrong. All the toys were in a circle, not scattered randomly like kids usually leave them. A perfect, precise circle in the middle of the room. "Who's here?" I demanded, my voice echoing too loudly. I hated how small it sounded in the vast silence. No answer. I stepped further inside, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The air was colder here, and I felt the hair on my arms rise beneath my sweater. And then from behind me came the unmistakable sound of tiny feet running across the tiles. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But the door was still closed, the hallway beyond it empty. The giggle came again, right behind me. I turned so fast I nearly tripped over one of the tiny chairs. The circle of toys was no longer empty. A doll now sat at the center. I hadn't seen it there before. It was one of those old-fashioned porcelain dolls, the kind with painted cheeks and glassy eyes that stared straight ahead. Its head was slightly tilted, as if it were looking at me. I backed away, my breathing shallow. "Whoever's doing this, it isn't funny," I shouted, my voice shaking. The doll's head moved. It was slow, deliberate, the tiny neck twisting until the glassy eyes locked onto mine. I ran. I don't remember much about how I got out of the playroom, only that my footsteps echoed like gunshots as I bolted down the hallway. The giggling followed me, growing louder, more distorted, like it wasn't just one child anymore, but a chorus of them. By the time I reached the front doors, I was gasping for air. My hands trembled so much it took me 3 tries to get my key into the lock. When I finally burst outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The building stood behind me, dark and silent, the windows like empty eyes watching as I sped away. I didn't go back for the rest of the week. When I finally returned after winter break, everything seemed normal. No giggles, no strange circles of toys. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched me that night and let me go. I still stay late sometimes, but I never ever go near the playroom after dark. Story 7. I've been driving trucks for nearly 10 years now, mostly running midnight shifts. Something about the stillness of the night always appealed to me. No bustling cities, no crowded roads, just the hum of my engine and the open highway. But one night a few months ago, somewhere in the mountains of California on Route 89, I came across something that shook me to my core, something I've struggled to put into words ever since. I live in Sparks, Nevada. It's a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knows your name at the diner and your neighbors wave even if you're just passing by. Most of my shifts take me through familiar routes, Reno to Sacramento, Reno to Salt Lake. But that night I was heading to a distribution center in Reno, coming up from Fresno. My shift had started at midnight sharp. By the time I reached the mountains, it was around 3 a.m., that dark, uneasy hour when everything feels just a little off. I remember the weather clearly. The moon was barely visible, smothered by thick clouds. The air was crisp, and a fine mist clung to the trees lining the highway. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding road ahead. It was the kind of night where you could hear every creak and groan of your rig, where the silence felt heavier than usual. But I didn't feel alone. I didn't know why, but something gnawed at me, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It started subtle. At first, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the road in the distance, just beyond the reach of my high beams. I brushed it off. My eyes were tired, and I'd been chugging coffee all night. Nothing unusual, but as I rounded a bend, my CB radio crackled with static. No voices, just a faint, unsettling hiss. I adjusted the dial, but it wouldn't clear up. I switched it off, telling myself it was probably interference from the mountains. Still, the silence that followed felt wrong, like something was waiting. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a black bear, standing off to the right side of the road. I slowed down instinctively, squinting at the figure. But as my truck approached, the shape began to change, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. The figure stood on two legs, hunched but tall, impossibly tall, easily 7 or 8 feet. Its arms were too long, its limbs too thin. The way it moved, the way it shifted wasn't right. It wasn't natural. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it seemed to shimmer slightly under my headlights. And the face, oh God, the face. Its eyes were enormous, glowing faintly, and its mouth was wide, stretched into something between a grin and a snarl. It didn't look human. It didn't look like anything I've ever seen. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly, staring at me as I approached. I slowed to a crawl, the truck rumbling beneath me, but I didn't dare stop. My chest tightened with a fear I'd never felt before. Primal, suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep moving, to not look too long, but I couldn't help it. As my truck passed the creature, I swear to God it turned its head to follow me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I felt like it was looking straight into my soul. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like prey. Its mouth opened wider, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth, and then it moved. Just a step, barely a shift in weight, but it was enough. It was coming toward the road. Panic set in. I slammed on the gas, my engine roaring as the truck surged forward. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see the thing chasing me, but the road behind me was empty, or at least it looked empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somewhere in the dark, watching me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station just outside Truckee. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the ignition off. I stumbled out of the cab, needing air, needing to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The night clerk, a young guy with earbuds in, barely glanced at me as I walked in to buy another coffee. I wanted to tell him what I saw, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? That I saw a monster in the mountains? That something not of this world had looked at me like it knew me? I sat in my truck for a long time before getting back on the road. The rest of the drive to Reno was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the fear, the feeling of being watched. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, something I hadn't done in years. I spent the entire day jumping at shadows, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. I haven't driven that route at night since. I don't think I ever will. Story 8. I used to work at a Kmart just off the main highway in our small, sleepy town. It was a quiet place for the most part, tucked between an old gas station and a half-abandoned strip mall. I was in my mid-20s, stuck in that weird in-between phase of life where you're working a dead-end job, waiting for the next thing to come along. The store had seen better days. The shelves looked tired, the paint peeled in places, and the customers trickled in slower with every passing month. You could tell it was on its last legs. But it wasn't the wear and tear of time that made the place unsettling. It was the layaway area upstairs. It's hard to describe the feeling up there. It was as if the air grew heavier the moment you stepped onto those stairs. Even though I never worked overnight, there were always stories from the closing crew. Footsteps echoing above them when no one was up there. The sound of boxes scraping across the floor, or faint knocking on the walls. People laughed it off during the day, but once the sun dipped below the horizon, that laughter disappeared. I had my own moments. The stairs leading up to layaway had a motion sensor light. Normally, it would flicker on when you reached the first step, bathing the stairwell in harsh fluorescent light. but sometimes you could make it all the way to the top without the sensor kicking on. And then, as you turned to leave, the light would suddenly snap on, as if someone or something was standing right behind you. Around 2:15, I heard it, a door creaking open. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone trying not to be noticed. My head shot up and I scanned the hallway. Room 19. The door had opened just a crack, maybe an inch or two. My pulse quickened as I squinted into the dimness. From where I sat, I could barely make out a shape behind the doorframe. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice steady. "Are you all right in there?" No response. I stepped closer, one cautious foot after another, the sound of my sneakers on the tile unnaturally loud. I stopped about 10 feet away. "Do you need something? Are you feeling okay?" That's when I saw him, just half of his face. He leaned out from behind the door so slowly it made my skin crawl. Only one eye, one cheek, and a sliver of his mouth were visible. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his hair hung limp over his forehead. His eye fixed on me, unblinking. "Do you need help?" I asked again, trying to keep my voice calm. He whispered something. I couldn't make it out. It was so faint it might as well have been the wind brushing past my ear. "Sorry, I didn't catch that," I said, taking a cautious step closer. But instead of answering, he slowly pulled back into his room, disappearing behind the door. The door closed with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, waiting for I don't know what. I was used to unusual behavior from patients. This wasn't the first time someone had acted strangely during the night, but there was something off about him, something that made my stomach twist. I waited a minute, maybe two, before returning to my seat. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was disoriented. Maybe he was sleepwalking. I wrote a quick note in my log, glancing back at room 19 every few seconds. And then it happened again. The door creaked open. I froze. My pen hovered over the page, motionless. This time it opened wider, 4 or 5 inches. The same face appeared, leaning out at that same excruciatingly slow pace. He stared at me, his lips moving, whispering something inaudible from across the hallway. I stood up again, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. "What's going on? Chonchid?" I asked louder this time. No response, just the faint movement of his lips. I started walking toward him. My gut told me to stay back, but my training wouldn't let me ignore it. 10 feet, 5 feet. The closer I got, the clearer I could see him. His eye was bloodshot, rimmed with dark shadows, and his lips were cracked and dry. "Can you speak louder?" I asked, stopping just outside his door. He stopped whispering. His lips froze mid-syllable. For a moment, we just stood there, me outside the door, him half hidden behind it. Then with that same unbearable slowness, he leaned back into the room. The door swung shut in silence. I should have checked on him. I should have opened the door and gone inside to make sure he was okay. That's what I was trained to do, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, and my hands were trembling. Something about the way he moved, the way he stared, it wasn't normal. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I sat down at my desk and stared at the door to room 19, half expecting it to open again. But it didn't. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The hallway was deathly quiet. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way back to the room. My hands shook as I reached for the handle, but I forced myself to turn it and push the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The chair was tucked under the small desk. The bathroom door was wide open, the light off. There was no sign anyone had been there. I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I double-checked the patient list. Room 19 was unoccupied. It had been for weeks. I didn't sleep that morning when my shift ended. Story 10, I used to work the night shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., as a nursing assistant about 15 years ago. My station was the surgical floor, a place where most patients were either preparing for or recovering from operations. It wasn't a quiet place, but it had its rhythms. From time to time, though, they'd send overflow our way, patients from other units, often more critical or occasionally at the end of their lives. Those nights were heavier. You'd feel it in the air. Hospitals at night are peculiar. They're bustling enough that you're never truly alone. But shadows stretch farther than they should, and silence pools in unexpected corners. I always preferred to keep moving, partly to keep the weight of the place from pressing down on me, but also because the stillness never sat right. One night we had an elderly man admitted, Mr. Klein, I think his name was. He wasn't post-op like most of my patients. He'd been sent up as overflow from another unit, listed as end-of-life care. His vitals were weak, and though he was technically conscious, he didn't seem fully present. He just stared at the ceiling, eyes cloudy, mouth slightly open, barely blinking. His breathing was shallow, labored, and it felt like he was teetering on the edge. I felt a pang of sadness every time I stepped into his room. Around 3 a.m., it was time to give Mr. Klein his bed bath. Nights like this, tasks were my lifeline, something to keep me grounded. I gathered my supplies, pushed open the door to his room, and closed it gently behind me. The dim light above his bed gave just enough illumination to work by. I greeted him softly, though I didn't expect a response, and began the familiar routine. The first knock startled me. It was sharp, deliberate, and echoed through the room. I froze, sponge in hand, my heart thudding hard in my chest. The door was shut, so I figured maybe one of the nurses needed something. I called out, "Just a second," but there was no reply. Wiping my hands quickly on a towel, I went to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty, silent except for the distant hum of machines. Shrugging it off, I went back to Mr. Klein, murmuring an apology even though I knew he couldn't hear me. I resumed washing him, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Then it came again. Knocking. This time it was louder. My head jerked toward the door, but the sound wasn't coming from there. It was coming from the window. Now let me paint you a picture. Mr. Klein's room was on the second floor of the hospital, facing the parking lot. There was nothing outside that window but air and asphalt. Yet there it was, 3 distinct knocks, clear as day, as if someone was standing just on the other side of the glass. For a moment I just stared, my mind racing for explanations. Maybe it was a bird or some kind of mechanical noise. Maybe I was imagining it. Taking a deep breath, I set down the washcloth and went to the window. The blinds were drawn, and I hesitated before pulling the cord. My hand trembled as I slowly opened them. When I did, my stomach dropped. The parking lot stretched out below, dimly lit by the overhead lamps. Nothing unusual, no movement, no sign of anyone. But what made my blood run cold was the sheer impossibility of the situation. The knocks had been deliberate, purposeful, and right there on the glass, 2 stories off the ground. I stood frozen, staring out into the night, half expecting something or someone to suddenly reveal itself. But the longer I looked, the more the silence pressed in around me. My breath fogged the glass slightly as I leaned closer, squinting for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the empty lot and the faint outline of trees swaying in the distance. Trying to shake off the fear clawing at my chest, I yanked the blinds shut and stepped back. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath. This was a hospital, not some haunted house. There had to be a reasonable explanation. There always was. I turned back to Mr. Klein, who hadn't moved a muscle. His cloudy eyes stared blankly upward, as if oblivious to everything around him. I hurried through the rest of the bed bath, the hair on the back of my neck prickling the entire time. Every sound seemed magnified. The rustle of the sheets, the faint beeping of the monitor, the shuffle of my shoes on the floor. And then it happened again. 3 knocks. Louder this time, almost angry. The sound reverberated through the room, making my chest tighten with fear. I froze, my eyes snapping to the window, though I didn't dare move closer this time. My mind screamed at me to leave, to just grab my things and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the spot, and all I could do was stare at the closed blinds, half expecting them to fly open on their own. I don't know how long I stood there, heart hammering, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The knocks didn't come again. The room remained still, eerily quiet except for the shallow rasp of Mr. Klein's breathing. Finally, I snapped out of it. Without looking back at the window, I grabbed my supplies and bolted for the door. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I just needed to get out of that room. My hands were trembling as I stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights feeling far too bright after the oppressive darkness of Mr. Klein's room. I spent the rest of the shift avoiding that room as much as I could, only going in when absolutely necessary and never staying longer than a few minutes. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.